There's a dinner tonight for conference speakers and commentators. It was supposed to be at 8, but actually it is 7. And those who are staying, there will be taxis taking our foreign guests to the hotel after this last session. And then at quarter to 7, there will be taxis taking those staying at the hotel to the restaurant, which is Bariba in the Tel Aviv port. So you're kindly requested to be at the lobby of the hotel at quarter to 7. Tomorrow there's a trip to Jerusalem. Those who are going, please be at the lobby at 8:30. And Sefi will be there too. She's joining us for the trip, which is really the fun part of this conference, although all the conference was fun. So she'll be there to make sure that the few people that are going from the hotel will get on the minibus that we rented. Okay, so that's the administrative stuff. Now, kind of for a bit more substance, I just want, on behalf of the organizers, who asked me to do it, I want to thank, first of all, thank all of you who speakers and commentators and chairs who participated. Okay. Okay. So I want to thank all the speakers, commentators, and chairs. I'd also like to thank, institutionally thank my own institution, the Berg.
I want to thank myself.
So, not myself. I want to thank Sefi.
Commend myself for organizing such a wonderful conference.
I was not the organizer. So I want to thank Sefi Van Rop, our very able administrative coordinator of the Institute. You'll see it on the video because she's not here. And I also like to thank the Segla. Okay. I want to thank the Segla Center for Interdisciplinary Research of the Law, which is the main research institute of our law school and very generously provided part of the funding for this conference, and its director, Sharon Hannes. And most of all, I'd like to thank the 3 organizers, Chris, Roy, and mostly Anat, who's kind of spirit, which is kind of really the real kind of spirit behind this wonderful conference. So that
this wouldn't have been possible without you 3 seriously now.
Me? Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to chair this session. Although I am not a legal historian by any stretch of the imagination, I do like detective stories, and I even co-authored once as a PhD student an article about detective story with Loris Friedman. But enough about me. No. Okay. I will present. We have only one speaker and one commentator this session. One bailed out at the last moment, right? So we have a little bit more time, I think. But you all seem very tired, so we won't, go for the whole time. So our speaker is Professor Stephen Wilf, the Anthony Smith Professor of Global Commerce at UConn Law School. His research focuses on intellectual property law and legal history. He's the author of several books and numerous articles. He got many interesting positions in different places. And he's a true Yaley. He got his both PhD in history and his law degree from Yale University. And he will talk to us about the legal historian as a detective.
Thank you. I always wanted to begin a session like David Shore with a phrase like best viewed in color, or maybe like a SOP. This is the fun part of the conference. But instead, I'm going to simply begin with a spoiler alert. I'm about to ruin for you somewhere between 10 and 13 different detective stories if you've read the paper. And I apologize, but what can you do? That's what, there are sacrifices to being a scholar. And what I tried to do in this paper, why I went to detective fiction, of which I'm not a fan, is because I was interested in what happens to the legal historian as a protagonist in the sphere of detective fiction. Partly it was almost like a thought experiment. To the extent that we have an expert witness who's a psychiatrist, what it would be like to have an expert witness who is a legal historian. Other than the fact that that person might go on for too long or might have too many citations, what kind of usable past might they contribute to an instant case? And what appealed to me about the legal historian as detective was precisely that detective fiction was not terribly great fiction. So we've been speaking about the contributory part, the compensatory aspect of law and literature. Law and literature can provide a kind of depth of character, like we might have with Styron's descriptions of Nat Turner. It might provide a kind of deep reading of the human psyche, like Leora's description of Oedipus. But I was actually interested in the thin, not the thick. I wanted to look at what can be used in a kind of minimalist way in this fashion. So to do so, my original intention was to look at 3 different series of detective novels. One, which is only truncated in the written paper, by Frédéric Audin-Rousseau, known as Fred Vargas, who is a well-known archaeologist, medievalist, an expert on the Black Plague, actually, in France, and has written a series of 3 novels about 3 characters, one a paleo historian, one a medievalist, and one World War I historian, who occupy a large, rambling house. They're all unemployed, by the way. Occupied this large, rambling house in Paris, and on the very top is this police detective with a huge paper archive. It's sort of like God sitting at the very top of the house, and each one has a floor chronologically downwards. Sarah Caldwell, who is the daughter of a woman who was who was a model for Sally Bowles in Isherwood's Berlin Stories, and has written a series of 4 detective stories about an Oxford dame named Hilary Tamar, and then Israel's Batya Gur, who wrote 6 novels about an Israeli police inspector, Micha Ochayon. So the sort of unifying feature to detective fiction as a whole is its conventionality. It's what Dorothy Sayers called in her Oxford lecture, Aristotle on detective fiction, a collection of noble, stable technologies of detection. It could be logical deduction, it could be forensics, but again and again is formulaic and conventional. And this is very true for the novels that I'm describing. Again, I'll put aside for a moment the Fred Vargas, the French novelist. Sarah Caldwell's 4 Hilary Tamar novels has as a core protagonist an Oxford Don, a legal historian, named Hilary Tamar, who's working on a history of causa, and she or he is otherwise known for his or her vexed sex. Somehow, in the midst of these 4 novels, we never know what gender he or she is. Fortunately, they're written in the first person. And the degendering is part of a disconnection, and a way to frame that novel in a way that allows the character to be a figure who is really instrumental, a vehicle for furthering the plot. But on the other hand, because it's historical, there's this whole dimension which he or she brings. And the core of the Sarah Caldwell stories is always revolves around. They always begin with a visit of Tamar to his students or her students in chambers in London. He or she is completely obtuse, out of touch, like a typical law professor, and interested in Mandarin law, knowing nothing about the real world. And of course, there's a homicide, and he or she uses various textual methods to resolve that homicide. It might be textual methods like the use of multiple examples, looking for multiple examples of a single text. It's always some rhetorical form that's being used. Batya Gore's Micha Ochayan is also trained in legal history. He studied the legal history of guilds at Hebrew University. He's Sephardi Jew, Moroccan background, and he was very much an outsider in the old German Jewish Hebrew University. And it's that outsider piece that allows him to really understand what societies are like. And there's a very set formula for all the Batya Gore novels. He goes to a closed society, and the closed society could be a psychoanalytic institute, it could be a kibbutz, it could be a collection of musicians, it could be the literature faculty at Hebrew University. Of course, there's a homicide, often multiple homicides. And he resolves that by determining what transgressions have occurred that are core to that closed society, which an outsider wouldn't know, and which can only be determined by a kind of in-depth historical study of what matters. And so if you look at these two sets of novels, Sarah Caldwell's and Batya Gore's, you really see the two kind of classic moves of legal historians, which of course is either the study of text or the study of context. And the various formulas are neat in the sense that they do what formulas are supposed to do. They heal the trauma of the violence of the crime. They tie together the parts of the narrative. They neatly resolve the murders. They cure what Irene called Ravit, referring to Ravit, the radical disruptions. So the language is really lapidary in a sense. The novels are lapidary insofar as they smooth over the traumas and the disruptions. And this goes on, as I said, for 3 Sarah Caldwell novels, and for 3 out of the 4 Sarah Caldwell novels, and for 5 out of the 6 Batya Gore novels. And then, strikingly, both of these novelists, both of whom die fairly young, around the same age, of cancer, both of them write a last novel. And in their last novels, they deviate radically from the textual formula for Sarah Caldwell and the contextual formula for Batya Gore. Sarah Caldwell's The Sibyl in Her Grave, her last novel. I'm not going to describe the plots of these novels because, like all detective novels, they're deeply intricate and it would take me forever. But there is in that novel, The Sibyl in Her Grave, a psychic who operates in a small English village, and there's a very complicated novel about financial matters, etc., all around this, but the homicides are related to the psychic. And Hilary Tamar is able to resolve all the financial issues perfectly, but when it gets to the homicides, he's completely baffled. And what he doesn't understand, of course, is that no one has been killed, murdered at least, in the Sibyl in Her Grave. It is, as one of the characters says, a bit of a cheat for a detective novel because you have no victims. But what you do have is a psychic who, when someone dies by accident, is sure that she did it. Who gives people hemlock in order to cure them, who's sure of her psychic healing powers when the hemlock seems to have some negative effects. Surprise, surprise. And she, the psychic, is as Hilary Tamar describes her. She's someone who, in order to deceive others, I quote, it is necessary also to deceive oneself. She's like the actor playing Hamlet, who believes that she is indeed that he is indeed the Prince of Denmark. And The Sibyl in Her Grave is striking because Tamar fails. And Tamar fails because he understands text, but he doesn't really understand context. He doesn't understand the Sibyl's need to be needed. He doesn't understand the way her supernatural powers operate within the context of the village. He or she doesn't understand the fact that someone might actually believe in their religious capacity in the way that someone from the Middle Ages very well might, even though he's a medieval historian. In the Murder in Jerusalem, the last Batya Gur novel, at least that's the title of the English version, there is a platoon which commits the murder of Egyptian POWs during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And here it's Michal Ochayon who has a problem, because he's used to a closed society, and he thinks he has a closed society because this murder takes place in a film studio which is filming Agnon's story Ido and Enam, and he's and you could work out what a film studio is or what a journalists have as their culture, what norms might be transgressed, what might lead to the murder. What he ultimately finds out is it's not that the film studio is a closed society or the cinematographers are a closed society. What he ultimately finds out is that all of Israel is a closed society. And the closed societies don't have hedges and borders in quite the same way, but they're closed societies largely because they have texts. The context, in a sense, is predicated upon the text or the mythos. And in this case, the problem with the crime was that the crime denies the very mythos upon which the society was based. And I quote from the confession of the killer. My whole life, our whole lives, are a cover-up for the murder of our mother and father. We've murdered a whole way of life, the belief in purity. And so the discussion is really one ultimately of the mythos. And the question is, which Michal Ochayon is unsure of as he investigates this murder. What he's unsure of is, in fact, whether the truth, which of course is a norm for the closed society of journalists and cinematographers and those involved with Israel television, whether the truth, in fact, is the ultimate good. This goes back to Leora's question, which she raised yesterday: is the truth an ultimate good? And so the murder that takes place in this, as I said, took place during the filming of Agnon's story Ido and Enam. And Ido and Enam is a very puzzling story. It's about a linguist who is trying to recover a lost mythological language, or at least a language from the distant past. He's trying to recover this language. It's an ancient language. He has an imperfect copy of a lexicon for this language, but he doesn't have the language itself. He's able, through his kind of hypnotic capacities, able to turn the young woman Gamula into a figure who climbs rooftops in the evening, stands in the full moon, and speaks this language beautifully and recites verses in this pure language. Ultimately, the Gamula will tumble to her death and die, much like the actress who plays her in the film version in the murder mystery. And the question is, did Gamula get pushed to the recovery of this language in a way that was damaging? Is there some way that pushing through recovery of a truth, of an ancient language, something which can lead ultimately to death and destruction? There's a long discussion at the end of the novel between Michal Ochayon and his difficult adolescent son, where he tries to argue that, in fact, we might want to preserve myths, preserve texts, preserve the very norms which in these closed societies have been causing trouble for him in all the other novels, but preserve those because they also might serve as a good, and that in fact truth might not be the ultimate end. So one of the things that intrigued me about this sort of ending for both Sarah Caldwell and for Batya Gur is that Sarah Caldwell shifts her formulas from text to context, and Michal Ochayon, Batya Gur's Michal Ochayon, shifts from context to text. And it's kind of a Mobius almost of a kind of a way that text and context meld into each other. And in some ways, I think this story might very well be about the incapacity of either text or context to work in a perfectly functioning fashion. In some ways, text, context, constellating. I don't even know if I can say the word constellating. I try to say it, and my teeth begin to feel like they're going to get unstuck. That all of these, are constructed forms of dealing with history, and they crumble when you least expect it. So I think that first is this kind of constant, almost M.C. Escher way that text and context shift back and forth with each other. The second, I think, point is that both of these stories have a prophetess at the very core. It's either the Sibyl. I describe this to a much greater extent in the story, how the Sibyl is a figure in the Sibyl in her grave, which has prophetic significance beyond the story itself, or it's Gamula, the figure speaking the ancient languages on the rooftops of Jerusalem in the full moon. But both of these prophetic figures talk about the difficulty of how historians can deal. They raise a difficulty of how historians can deal with the prophetic voice, the voice that's irrational, the voice that is like Nat Turner's, the voice that, as Shai Levi says, peers into the Dionysian abyss. So there is that second aspect, which is the difficulty of the prophetic voice. And the third problem, I think, is what does it mean when one begins to identify this history which neither can be addressed in context or context. One of my favorite parts of Chris's paper is when he talks about the past overcoming pastness. And I think that there's a way that at the end of both, in the very final words of both Hilary Tamar and Micha Ochayan, are trying to grapple with what they've learned as lessons in these last novels, as historical method has fallen apart, how they're going to take this past and surmount its pastness.